Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2026 webinar series, Realizing Resilient Watersheds. This is a webinar series that's put on by the Water Planning Council's Outreach and Education Work Group. The Water Planning Council is the state agency, is a combination of state agencies, Office of Policy and Management, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the Department of Public Health, and the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And these four agencies come together to do water planning under a state water plan and do as well as the education and outreach that we're doing today. So we're really happy to be doing our theme this year, Realizing Resilient Watersheds, and we're going to kick it off with what are watersheds anyway? Watersheds 101 and what's happening in Connecticut. And we're so pleased today to have Chris Bellucci here. Chris is the Assistant Director of Water Planning and Management Division at the Bureau of Water Protection and Land Use at DEEP, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So welcome, Chris. I'll let you introduce yourself further and start your program.
Great. Thank you, Denise, and thank you, the Water Planning Council, and all the work you guys do to set up these and provide the space. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about Watersheds 101. And I have lost my ability to advance the slide. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to provide a little bit of an outline of what this talk is all about today. So I'm going to get into a little bit about just describing watersheds. And I know a lot of us, work in watersheds, but it's good to take a step back and kind of think about it. I know a lot of us are oriented about what town we live in, but think about what watershed you might live in. Think about as you drive across the state, what watershed you're in. It's really important to the work we do. I'm going to talk a little bit about Connecticut and the watersheds that we have, and we have kind of a unique system that goes back to the 70s where we have our own description of watersheds. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I have a few slides on, what happens when you get beyond the border of Connecticut. How do we talk about watersheds on a larger scale? Talk a little bit about how we use watersheds as a planning unit and the work that we do at DEEP in the water planning programs, and then finally we'll have some Q&A. So what is a watershed? A watershed it's an area of land separated by ridges. If you ever been on a hiker, you've been on the top of a ridge, you'll know that on one side of the ridge it drains to one side, and the other side of the ridge drains to the other. And it drains all the precipitation and streams, etc., to a common point on the landscape. And then sometimes it creates confusion. Sometimes that the word watershed is used interchangeably with drainage basin or catchment. And I think of it this way. Here you see a beautiful watershed out in the west. The catchment is a term that you'll see a lot in European writings and more, in some of the GIS work. They all sort of function as a unified stream ecosystem. They all, take the runoff from the land and drain essentially the land to a point. They are excellent study units, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And finally, everybody lives in a watershed, and hopefully you're thinking of that. And to make sure everybody's awake, we're going to have some participation here, and I'm going to put up a poll and want you guys to take a look at this. So this is the major basins of Connecticut, and fill in the poll and make one choice on what watershed you live in, and then we'll have a little demo. And if you don't know exactly, take your best guess, and then we'll give it a few minutes to do the poll here. Wow, that was quick. So, Connecticut Basin wins. Looks like a little around 31% of the folks um, are in the Connecticut River watershed. We're going to do a little demo. This is a really cool tool that I came across somewhere in my travels. It's a visualization, and we're going to zoom into the Connecticut watershed so you kind of see how the land draining, if a raindrop falling in the Connecticut watershed. It looks like Ali zoomed into an area in West Hartford. If you click on it, it will show you where that land drains to. Crossing fingers that the demo will work. Sometimes it's always,
It's taking some time to load.
yeah. You might have to zoom in. Oh, you're in pretty far.
I'm going to quickly just refresh.
Okay.
We'll go back to Connecticut, to the Connecticut River Basin. We'll go right here.
In order for it to work, the computer needs to cooperate, right, Ali?
Oh, yeah. Well, anyway, anyone can go to this website, zoom into where you live, and see where the precipitation on your property drains to.
Yeah. It is cool. I have a link in the presentation to the site. So,
Do you want me to stop sharing, Chris?
yeah, let me go. I have a
Okay.
backup because just in case this happened. So,
And Allie might maybe put that link in the chat.
Great idea. You got it.
yeah. So the app is called River Runner Visualization, and it's here on the slide. And I did a demo. I can't remember where I chose, but basically, if you click on the dot as Ali was showing you, and your computer um, isn't having issues, this is kind of what you get. So it actually does. It's in the looks like it's in the right basin. Um, so if you could follow the mouse, it drains down here to the Connecticut River, follows the Connecticut River, and down to the Sound, and you actually get a flyover visualization. So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool application. I encourage you to try it out on your own. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled program here. So a watershed consists of surface waters, lakes, streams, reservoirs, wetlands, and the underlying groundwater. Now, it's important to note that sometimes the underlying groundwater could be a little different than the surface water. I won't get into details of that, but it's just something important to take note of. And the ridges and hills that separate two watersheds are called the drainage divide. And perhaps one of the most famous ones that people think of is the Continental Divide. So if you look at the graphic on the right and the map, everything that would be on the left-hand side would drain to the Pacific Ocean. Everything that would be on the right would drain down over to the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. And I took this shot when I was in Colorado. It's me standing being a watershed person. It's me standing on the Continental Divide and taking a picture somewhere in Colorado. I can't remember where, but it was on the Continental Divide. One of the important concepts to think about when you're thinking about watersheds is larger watersheds contain smaller watersheds. So, it all depends on the scale that you want to work on and think about. So it's important to kind of keep in mind nesting of watersheds, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And this idea of land cover, the water quantity and quality in watersheds are affected tremendously by what happens on the land, and I know folks know that. I'll give you some background on that, and this is a cool diagram I found on the USGS website. It's perhaps the best depiction of the water cycle that I've seen. Really detailed and incorporates, groundwater and evapotranspiration and glaciers and snowpack, and it's really um, kind of a great diagram. But I just wanted to again point out that you wouldn't expect, the rivers and streams up in the wooded areas to be the same as rivers and streams down in the municipal area that's developed. And again, hammering this point home, land cover impacts rainfall, runoff, flooding, and water quality tremendously. Here you see a picture of, largely built out area. Undoubtedly, the watercourses in this area are impacted by that. So to emphasize this a little bit more, our biological monitoring that we do and how healthy streams are. We've done a lot of work in this regard, and the local habitat and critters in the stream are really impacted by development. And here you see a cartoon of impervious land cover, and as the land cover more imperviousness, we expect more degraded conditions using macroinvertebrates. And so this biological integrity scale would be, essentially stream health. And we know that when we're have low imperviousness in the forests, we usually have very natural and healthy systems. So, and, I remind people of, this thought process goes back way back, and there's a famous ecologist, H.B. Hines, that said, "In every respect, the valley rules the stream," meaning that really what you do on the land impacts what goes on in the water. So here's I'm going to get a little geeky and give you a little data. This is again that same graph that we have. So imperviousness and our macroinvertebrate MMI, that is essentially a measure of stream health. MMI stands for multi-metric index. We'll get into the details of that, but essentially the same thing that you saw on the cartoon. The higher values are better. Higher is good, and the lower values are less good. And this is sort of what we use when we evaluate this bright red line, is what we use when we evaluate, when we do our assessments. And anything above the line, these sites up here essentially meet or are healthy, and they meet our aquatic life goals. And anything below these sites here don't meet our aquatic life goals. And it's fairly unusual in the biological sciences to find such a striking relationship as we hear. Like as we go up, imperviousness, we see, definitely trend here going down. And one of the more remarkable things is when you get up into this area, so you get high imperviousness. We don't have any sites at all in all the monitoring we have ever done that once you get to a certain level of imperviousness that are healthy streams. And, the cutoff is around 12%, somewhere in here. And then you see this big white space here. There's no sites up in that. So that's important to think of. And we use these macroinvertebrates to measure water quality, because they live in the stream and they're exposed to everything that comes down. And so they're very good, very well-known water quality indicators. I have the map on the right because some of the early work we've done here was up in Eagleville Brook watershed up near Yukon. And this is kind of we've done, like I said, we did a lot of work here that kind of formed the basis for a lot of the thought patterns we had on imperviousness. And it's kind of somewhat unique in that most of the imperviousness shown in red is up in the top of the watershed. And it drains down here into Eagleville Pond. So it turns out when we started looking at this, it's not only macroinvertebrates, but species like native brook trout, important indicator species in streams, they don't like imperviousness either, right? So this map shows in the grade areas, I'm using that rough cutoff of 12% again that I showed in the previous map. The gray shows the areas of the state that were greater than 12 at the time we did this analysis. And the circles, the orange circles, are places where brook trout were present. And you'll note that a lot of the areas that are greater than 12%, you don't see brook trout in those areas. So fish often respond in a similar way to macroinvertebrates. And this was a schematic that we had going back to that Yukon work, where we have the imperviousness mostly in the top of the watershed when it drains down to Eagleville Pond. We did some work out there, fish surveys, and we noticed up in the top there were really no fish. And then as we went down and got further away from the imperviousness, we started to see some fish, and then a few fish, and then some fish, and then this tributary came in. We actually got a few more, and then finally by the bottom we had some good fish. So it just kind of shows you that streams are resilient, but certainly land use has a big impact on them. So now I'm going to segue into Connecticut watersheds. And I mentioned we have sort of a unique system of classifying streams in Connecticut. We have, going back quite a ways, we have statewide mapping of natural drainage basins. And it's a hierarchical nested system, and it has numbers assigned to it, and the numbers mean something. And I'll go into this a little. You can see this work in a mapped form on CT Eco, and I provided the link here. So this is a schematic of the drainage basins of Connecticut. We started off our poll and discussion talking about major basins. So we have 8 major basins in the state, and then within the major basins, there are nested regional basins. There are 45 of those. They range in size from 40 to 400 miles squared. And then we have sub-regional basins, 337 of those. They range in size from 5 to 70 square miles. And local basins. And then finally, the smallest unit of measure that we have is the basin. So again, the basin size you choose depends on the work that you do, right? And what kind of questions you're trying to answer, and what kind of work you're going to do. And I provide the reference here to that work where this is where it all came from, the Gazetteer. So that's a great reference for this material. And I mentioned that there's also a numerical process or schematic, if you will. And they really thought about this when we developed it. So things in the Pawcatuck Main Basin have a 1 designation. Southeast Coastal is 2. Thames is 3. Connecticut 4. South Central Coast 5. Housatonic Major Basin 6. Southwest Coast 7, and then Hudson finally 8. So from east to west, numbered 1 through 8, and then the numerical scheme follows like this. So the major basin in this case is 4. So if you took a basin in Connecticut, the regional basin would have a 3 assigned to it. The sub-regional would have additional numbers assigned to it, et cetera, et cetera. So you can really tell, and the way the Gazetteer is set up is that you can go through and all these stream segments and lakes are numbered numerically. And that could be very helpful to you if you want to know what things drain to watch. Nowadays, we have a much better GIS, and it's easier to kind of look at that maybe in a map form, but back in the day, that's the way we did things. This is a picture of the Connecticut major basins, and you could take a visual of the land area that they occur in. Obviously, They don't really cut off at the state, as we know, but for this purpose, I cut it off, and we'll get into the discussion of what happens if it goes on the border in a bit. But this is sort of the land area that these basins cover, and I also calculated the stream miles. So if you look at the stream miles, the Connecticut, where most people on this talk live, has the majority of the stream miles, and then followed by the Thames and the Housatonic, about equal stream miles. And then the coastal basins, south central, southwest, followed by southeast, and then kind of our border basins, the Pawcatuck on the Rhode Island border and Hudson over on the New York border, a smaller amount of stream miles in the state in Connecticut. So what happens when we extend upon, we have this Connecticut specific kind of regional, sub-regional schematic. What happens when we go beyond the borders of Connecticut? What happens if you have a large project that extends way up north, for example? Here's an example of the Long Island Sound watershed. So much, much larger than we were talking about, over 16,000 square miles, goes all the way up to Canada, goes through Vermont, New Hampshire, Mass, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island. It's, on this scale, clearly the Connecticut system won't work. We need to have a different system to talk about and quantify the relationship of these basins. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I have a link here. I assume we can send these slides out after. This story map here is a live link. And there's a project was just released. Yukon Clear worked with our Long Island Sound partnership, and I know many of our folks who have been involved in this project. It's a really cool web application that you can kind of look at it and drill down into more detail on the Long Island Sound watershed. So what do we have when we extend about beyond the Connecticut border? We have this hydrologic unit code and this applies for the nation. So they're often referred to as HUCs. And it's very similar schematic to the way Connecticut's set up, where you have regional basins, they call them two-digit HUCs, being the largest, and sub-regional, et cetera. The smaller you get, obviously, the more units you have. And again, it's a nested type system. And again, it depends on what you're trying to do or study as to which HUC unit might be the most appropriate for you. I also have a link. I'll just point out there's a lot of links in this presentation, so I encourage people to kind of explore on their own. The USGS water boundary data set. It's kind of where it all comes from. And then, some of the work that we intersect with that kind of is, obviously the USGS works on a nationwide scale. So a lot of the work that they serve up is in HUCs. So here you see the Connecticut Water Conditions website, and on the left you have the continuous stream flow stations, and you can go into the map application. I don't have it live now, but you can, see a location and then click on it, and you'll get information on that particular location for stream flow. And then similarly, I pulled this data from our Water Planning Council's USGS report. This is a picture of water quality monitoring stations that we have in Connecticut for USGS. And their locations relative to their major basins. Just to bring your attention to something like National Wild and Scenic Rivers. It's a program that's been around for a while, recognizing outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values in free-flowing conditions of rivers throughout the country. So again, the HUC would be a more appropriate scale. or measure for something on a nationwide scale. And just calling your attention to, in Connecticut, we have five. We have the Housatonic, West Branch Farmington, Lower Farmington River, Salmon Brook, 8 Mile, and the Wood Pawcatuck, which borders Rhode Island. So that's a crash course in watershed as an entity, both in Connecticut, and what happens if we go on the border of Connecticut. And now I want to talk a little bit about some of our planning, the way we use watersheds at deep as a planning unit. One of the ways that we used it was in the stream flow standards and regulations. So the stream flow standards and regs were passed a while back, and one of the requirements of the reg had deep classify the stream flow class based on the 18 factors that were outlined in the regulation for the entire state. So how did we do it? Well, we used a watershed. We took GIS layers of the 18 factors. We developed preliminary stream flow classes, and we provided maps at a regional basin scale. Here you see a preliminary stream flow map. We went out to the public. We got input on, how we did. I mean, you can just imagine this is a daunting task. We have to come up with classifications for the whole state using 18 different factors. And I think without watersheds as a planning unit, I'm not sure how you would do this. And after the public participation phase, we adopted stream flow classes. And this is an older slide, so you see reference to DEP, because this work was done quite a while ago before we changed our name to DEEP. And then again, you see watersheds come into play as a planning unit. The way we rolled it out was we started in the eastern part of Connecticut. We combined the Thames, Pawcatuck, and Southeast coastals, so eastern Connecticut, into kind of a planning unit for this work. And we classified the streams in the eastern part of the state. And so one of the things about the stream flow reg is that the implementation, or when the releases occurred, was tied to when we classified the streams. And what that did was, number one, it gave us time to do all this work. So we did it in smaller chunks. But it also tied implementation for when folks need to do stream flow releases to when the work was completed to do the classification. And it did tremendously help to balance our workload at deep. And then we kind of moved westward, and the next basin we worked on was South Central Coast. Those stream flow releases are actually coming due this year. Then we did the Connecticut, so those releases are due in 2028. And then finally, the western part of the state, the Housatonic, Southwest Coast, and Hudson basins are due in March of 2029. I want to talk a little bit now, shifting gears a little bit to sort of watershed-based programming, how we're thinking of this within our water planning programs. So this is kind of what I call our work wheel. Kind of starts with on the ground monitoring, boots on the ground, trying to figure out how the water bodies are in the state of Connecticut. So we have a unit that focuses on that. We take that information that we get, we manage that and analyze it in database systems. We do assessments of those. So which ones meet our goals and which ones don't. We report on the water quality conditions in our integrated water quality report. And then once we have that, we are sort of in a planning mode. We have things like total maximum daily loads, watershed-based planning to move us from a known impairment um, into getting things done on the ground to make things better. And finally, doing implementation projects, and as we do those implementation projects, kind of having the feedback loop of circling back to monitoring. A little bit about how we think of monitoring. Basically, I think of it in three different levels. We have a long-term planning, and as we're thinking about this, call this our ambient monitoring strategy. We do that about every 10 years to go like, what do we really want to go after in 10 years? And then we have a 5-year horizon where we kind of want to do make sure we're hitting our trend stations, and we also do something called statistical or probabilistic monitoring, where we can get into um, statewide assessments of how are we doing in meeting our aquatic life goals. So it gives us a way to put a percentage of waters on a statewide scale. And then we implement it annually through a work plan that we work through to make sure our monitoring is coordinated with our other programs. And here you see a map of some of our long-term biological monitoring stations. And, we kind of leverage the USGS network of water quality stations and stream flow to co-locate some of these locations because we gain that much more information and have a really nice, solid, long-term um, network of sites where we can evaluate, change over time. And then I sort of hit on this in the circle slide. Once we know that a water body is impaired, we have the implementation plans like watershed-based planning. Here you see a report of the Agricola Brook watershed-based plan. They really focus on non-point source implementation projects and plans and identifying what we can do. I call them the what we can do where plans, as well as some loading information. So like, which parts of the watershed are contributing the most. And one of the things about these plans is if we have an approved plan that makes the watershed eligible for funding under our 319 program. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Total maximum daily loads is sort of a pollution budget or pie, if you will. Again, to help us quantify where the pollution is coming from. And, I kind of mentioned this is sort of like you can view it as a pollution budget line. We have good conditions on one side of the line and poor conditions on the other. And when we have these plans, we can often couple them with watershed-based plans to really go into sort of project implementation with solid planning documents. I mentioned funding. Here are a few things that I put on here, certainly not an exhaustive list, but programs like the NRCS Ag Assistance Programs. And again, these are links that you could check out for yourself if you're unfamiliar with these. Once we hand the presentation out, the NOAA Coastal Resilience Grants, we just got through with managing a Long Island Sound Partnership Ecosystem Grant. Those projects are under review now. And then these last two I wanted to highlight because they're actually open right now. So I'll spend a little bit more time on that. The Long Island Sound Futures Fund, and as well as of the EPA 319 non-point source grant. Long Island Sound Futures, I was excited. I was preparing this talk and this came across my desk. I think it was either late last week or early this week. So I'm like, oh my gosh, they put it in a watershed context. So I clipped out the map and then you'll see the watershed here. Going all the way up to its origins And the way they highlighted it was they have sort of different priorities for different parts of the Long Island Sound Basin. So again, watersheds in a grant proposal. How about that? So that's awesome. There's a link here to the funding request RFP, and important dates are highlighted here. They're having a bunch of workshops. So I encourage, if you're interested in applying for that you sit in and learn about the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. And then a little bit about our non-point source management program. We have been managing a 319 program since 1990, so we have a long history with that. The origin of the 319 is as part of the Clean Water Act, Section 319. And I think I highlighted this. It's focused on non-point source pollution reduction. DEEP typically awards roughly $1 million annually through a competitive process. I don't have much time, so what's today, the 20th? It closes on the 26th. So if you're interested in this, you got to get to work really quick because it closes. I put a link in here to the applications, and we expect to notify grant awards probably in the fall of this year. And I put a bullet here just to highlight that this program has also supported the conservation districts, again, to help manage statewide with non-point source pollution. So circling back to some of kind of putting projects in the ground in this watershed-based, process, monitoring, assessment, implementation, circle back to monitoring. So this is the Mill River Basin, sub-regional basin 5302. And where it comes in really handy is if there's lots of mill rivers, right? There's lots of mill rivers in the state. So if you are familiar with the nomenclature, you know that 5302 is the Mill River in Cheshire, Hampden, New Haven area. So monitoring has been going on in the Mill River watershed. There are impairments here noted in red. And we have a watershed-based plan for this basin. And here you see, all that planning coming to fruition where they did a project on the Hampden Town Park to build a huge, what I call contain the rain project. So lots of different names, rain garden, bioretention, basically taking that imperviousness idea and having Mother Nature treat it, store and treat it as she would have if we didn't pave it. This is a really neat project because it treats it's a unique in that there was a single pipe draining a very large area, 74 acres, roughly 21% imperviousness in that area, and a single pipe on land that the town of Hampden actually already had control of. So it's a really good project. We expect less flooding in that watershed, better water quality, and better water quality not only in Mill River but also because Mill River goes to Long Island Sound, better water quality. So moving from streams to lakes, I just wanted to highlight here's a concept where we're using watersheds to look at lake monitoring. So here's a bunch of locations and their level of imperviousness. So we have a study where we're looking at sediment diatoms statewide, and we're trying to sort of match the percent of study sites with kind of how they occur in the basin, the percentage of land mass. Now, sometimes it's difficult to exactly match it, but we're thinking of watersheds when we select our sites, because number one, we want to get statewide coverage, and number two, we don't want to have them all in the West, for example. So watersheds provide a really good context and a way to design study. And in our lake work, when we do our monitoring and then our assessment, I'm going to highlight Bantam Lake. So again, sub-regional basin 6705. We have a TMDL and a watershed plan in Bantam Lake, and it has some impairments. So again, what do we do? So then we have sort of we have the plan where it makes it eligible for funding. We have interest at the local level to do implementation projects. Highlighting here a couple items in the watershed plan where they've gone in and flagged locations. Here you see in the little callouts where we can do projects, and the watershed-based plan not only shows the where you can do best management practices or BMPs, but the expected pollution reduction that we might get if we put some of these designs in. And I'm just highlighting here a couple sources of phosphorus, that they have identified in the plan: parking lots, and of course agriculture. So the plans get us more information to move us away from, sort of a planning and then knowing that there's an impairment to doing something on the ground. And here, I can go on and on and on about how watersheds, are kind of integrated into our work. I'm highlighting a few here for you with links where we have them so you can explore on your own. We did a phosphorus reduction strategy where we looked at trying to reduce phosphorus in streams. That was done on a watershed basis. Our water quality classifications that kind of, in our water quality standards, the classifications kind of form the basis of what you can and can't do in our streams and rivers and lakes in Long Island Sound. That's all done on a watershed basis. And you can click on that and go into a mapping application and take a look at that. We have mapping applications, again, on a watershed basis of cold water habitat based on work we've done in Connecticut to define what a cold water means in Connecticut. And I know a lot of folks have used this in their planning processes, and I'll provide a link there. Aquifer protection area, same thing. We're looking at on a watershed basis. And I'll leave finally with this watershed water quality modeling. We have a really big project, multi-year project funded through the Long Island Sound Partnership, CTWIM, or Connecticut Watershed Model. Here you see kind of the extent of the model, and again, those little polygons are watersheds, and we think of it in watershed context. And we don't have anything quite ready for. I didn't have a link that I can provide, but we soon will, and we're more than welcome to share that information once we have it. And then I kind of wanted to bring it back to, the Water Planning Council and, some of the work that they have done. This is a state water plan. I pulled this excerpt from the state water plan, and I found it really interesting. I was kind of looking for examples to do for this presentation. And, I knew this, but when I found it like glaringly staring at me, I had to include an example here. Summary of key findings: key to making informed decisions about future water management is sound technical understanding of the condition of Connecticut's river basins, right? What's that? It's a watershed. So it's prominent in all the work that we do. And this is just highlighting, a very important aspect of the state water plan, which is a very important document to all of us. And I think we have time for some Q&A if there's any questions. I included this picture of a rain garden because those that know me is I'm on a mission to promote rain gardens. So I'm encouraging everybody on the call to go plant a rain garden. You can do it in your yard. It doesn't have to be big like Hamden. Everybody could do this. And if everyone does their little part, it'll make a difference. And, so that's my challenge to the group. Go plant a rain garden. And with that, I could take questions if we have time, Denise.
We do have time. Thank you very much. And no, I have one question in the chat from Kathy ZPL. Let me see if I can find it. So Kathy was saying she's curious about aquatic life criterion, namely what determines that cutoff. You had that real cutoff between what was healthy and unhealthy. And so could you talk a little bit more about that criterion?
Yeah, I can. So the example I showed was a stream example. So we, through our monitoring program, have developed cutoffs. So let me take a step back. So we have responsibilities on the Clean Water Act to do assessments of the waters of the state. So in that process, we developed a methodology that is in our integrated water quality report. It speaks to that very question. How do we do this? When we look at aquatic life, um, we look at the biological community because we think that's the strongest way to look at the living things in the stream. If there's healthy organisms in the stream, it's a healthy stream. But we also look, so fish, macroinvertebrates, diatoms, and the biological community. We also look at chemistry, water chemistry, and habitat and things like that. So it's really an integration of different measures for streams. And streams are one of those things that we've probably been at it the longest in study. So we have a lot of different techniques and a lot of different measures. And I'd be glad to share kind of the methodologies. We have it spelled out in our in some reports.
Thanks, Chris. And then the next question from Steve Dunsky is, what is the role of local watershed groups in citizen science monitoring?
That's a great question. We love local groups we we have a long-standing volunteer program in Connecticut. We're very fortunate. We have a stream monitoring program that has temperature monitoring for volunteers, macroinvertebrates, um, and also we recently started a lake volunteer group. So if you think about Connecticut, we're a small state, but we have a lot of water. So we welcome. We can't be everywhere. We welcome volunteer work. We have a program to help guide how that information could be used in our assessment process because we need to have quality information if we're going to use it for our Clean Water Act assessments. And we use that information. We have to do the water quality report every 2 years. We use that information for assessments, and I think I'll stick my neck out a little. I think we were, at least in New England, we were ahead of the curve a little bit with volunteer monitoring. We're using it for assessments well before everybody else, and I think we've convinced people along the way that it's okay to, as long as you're doing it in the smart manner, it's okay to use volunteer information for a Clean Water Act assessments.
All right, thanks. We have another question from Rich Boritz. And he says, what is the relationship between the Pomperaug Water Authority and DEEP? Are there workshops, planning meetings, etc.? And I'm assuming the Pomperaug Water Authority is the public water supply in the Pomperaug. Is that correct?
I know. Can you say a little bit more? Is he able to talk?
Nope. Let's actually, I'm going to allow Carol. I just let you talk. So could you fill us in on that just so that we can answer that question?
Sure. You want to just repeat the question again?
Yeah, it says, what is the relationship
public water
between,
supply.
yeah, is the Pomperaug Water Authority, what is that?
So that is, it was an entity that was created by legislative statute in the, I forget what time frame it was. I looked it up recently. And it was at the time that the Heritage Village Development Group was looking at building Heritage Village, 55 plus residential community of 5,000 households, and establishing a public water supply that would serve Oxford, Middlebury, and Southbury. And at the time, a public water supply did not exist within the Pomperaug Basin. And it was basically creating an authority to establish a public water supply for a regional area. Heritage Village ended up becoming its own private water supply system, community system, which has since been purchased by Connecticut Water Company. So it's an entity that exists only by legislative statute, and in order for it to disband, it would have to be dissolved through legislative statute as well. So the only reason that it kind of continues to exist is that if Connecticut Water decided it wanted to sell that water supply system, the regional water authority in that regard could become a managing entity. And it creates a system for financing the same.
Okay, so the question was, is there a relationship between the water authority and DEEP? And I'm going to give this to Chris, and thank you, Carol. Carol's the executive director of the Pomperaug River Watershed Association. But is the relationship, because it's about water supply, is it with DEEP or is it with Department of Public Health?
Yeah, my guess is, and thank you for that, Carol, because you did much better than I could have. So I think the relationship is probably more with DPH. I'm not familiar with that, but I'd be glad to follow up.
It may also be with PURA, but it's probably DPH. It would be similar to like how Regional Water Authority exists,
Yeah,
or MDC.
that's my guess.
Yeah.
All right. So hopefully we answered that question then. So let's see. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. James Furlow asks, are you aware of the lot size limitations being proposed at the state level? And with those limitations and increase in runoff and increased density and lack of local oversight, how can towns manage to protect watersheds, rivers, streams, and MS4? And I think he's relating to, as you know, there's a lot of talk about housing, and they're looking at saying we can no longer limit lot size. And so how does, I guess, Chris, the question would be, how does that fall into the thing we're working on with stormwater and water quality, resiliency? How does that fall into play in terms of when we're talking about, for example, low impact development? So how would, saying that we couldn't limit lot size fall into that? So if you have any thoughts on how we balance that need.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I can say without, the number one thing that causes issues with our streams and rivers and lakes in Long Island Sound is stormwater. Just because, we're a built up state in areas where we have, imperviousness, we know we have issues. So I think it should be a strong, I mean, this is just my opinion. I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of the legislation or the work, but I would recommend that we strongly consider, low impact development. If we're going to develop it in a smart, we need to do it in a smart way because we're contributing to, more impervious as we kind of know what the outcome will be. So I would say that if we're going to do it, it should be done, hopefully have requirements to do it smartly with LID.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I know that's one of the things we've been talking about at the Water Planning Council. I know I've brought it up that we need to have this balance, that we need housing, but we need to do
Yep.
housing right and make sure it's not conflicting with what we need to do for a resilient Connecticut to make sure we have clean, abundant water. So,
Yeah.
and also resiliency from flooding and all of those other challenges we look at. So let's see. I've just got another one. Mary Pelletier says, who determines how the MS4 funding requirements are successfully distributed to support public education per municipality? Are there funding requirements for the MS4?
What comes to mind, and I'm not sure I'm on target for Mary's question, but for example, our 319 program, if it's an MS4 requirement, they're not eligible. It's not eligible for 319 funding, and that's an EPA it's an EPA restriction. That might answer Mary's question. I'm not sure, but I'll be glad to follow up with you, Mary, if I didn't hit the target on that.
Okay. And then let's see, I think we're going to just take one more question. It says, and Matthew Connors writes, he works within a public drinking water supply. So he has DEEP and DPH supporting, but he said, what authorities exist outside? If you're not in a public drinking water supply, what authorities do you have to enforce water quality?
Yeah, I think I mean, we are homegrown state, and New England is the same way. I would say that a lot of it kind of falls on municipalities in some ways to, have their own kind of zoning rules that could influence water quality. I mean, that's the thing that comes to my mind. But it's tricky, and it's all about balance, right? Wanting just like the housing, you want houses, but you want them smart. So it's the same kind of a thing, I think, when it comes to, what can you do on a local level?
Yeah. And I mean, there are, obviously some work we can do. Non-point source is the challenge. The
It's
point
a
source,
challenge.
there's more, because it's about the way we live. And so it is about land use regulations, which take place at the local level.
Yeah,
So what the watershed management, it's a tough one. Because you have more enforcement authorities over poor point source pollution than non-point source. It's always a
right.
challenge.
Yeah.
And so I just want to, just one last question, and it says we are seeking stakeholders like Denise and Chris to learn about residential stormwater management counseling. Would it be okay to follow up? I'm going to say yes. How about you,
Yes.
Chris?
Yes, absolutely.
We'll definitely follow up, Kathy Fay, on that one. I want to thank Chris for all of this information. I am, it's like we all work in watersheds every day, but really understanding the kind of the bricks and mortar, if you will, of water resource management. How we look at drainage basins, how we number them, and where they are, all of that information, and how DEEP uses them, and all the technical assistance. Check out all the links that Chris provides. We're going to post this webinar, but we'll also post a link with all on the outreach and education website for the Water Planning Council with all of the links that he has, because there's so much good information in his presentation. So thank you again to Chris and to everyone who was in attendance. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.